Hello and welcome back to the One Piece saga, the series where I watch One Piece for the very first time and give my impressions as well as my overall thoughts of this incredibly long-running show. If this happens to be your first time joining us, you can go back to the first video in the series where I cover all the rules and technicalities of how I'll be approaching this, but with that out of the way, let's take a quick look at how the tier list looks right now. Currently, the reigning champion is still the Baratie arc, but is that going to change today? Or maybe will there be another one joining the ranks? Well, that's exactly what we will find out today. Also, initially in this video I planned to cover multiple arcs, but as I kind of went on a little bit too long, we'll be only tackling Arlong Park. So, without further ado, let's dive in. This arc kind of starts off quite differently from the previous ones, as usually the final arc has pointed us towards the direction where the next mission would take place, whereas Baratie directly showed us what Nami is up to. And that is exactly where we open, with Luffy and the rest of the crew trying to find Nami. What's also a little different from what we've seen so far is that we are introduced to the big bad right away, Arlong. And as I was working on this video, I realized that coming off of Baratie, I was extremely excited of what came next, and so, being introduced to an almost mythical-like being was really interesting. We'll talk about it a little more once we get to know his abilities and stuff, but just from this little teaser, I was already glued and knew that this arc would be interesting from the villain alone. And then came the biggest backstab I could have imagined. When I was writing down some notes while watching this, I literally wrote down, WTF, Nami is evil, what no? At this point, I was thinking back to when she went against Buggy, and I honestly couldn't believe that she was actually a part of Arlong's crew. But then, she even hits a kid, which sort of proved to me that she is indeed a baddie. So, Nami has left the crew? And even when she interacts with Arlong, she is in complete control of the narrative and even laughs of everyone she is taken advantage of. All of this is to say is that I really did not know what to think at this point. And in case I wasn't conflicted enough, after Zoro is taken hostage and taken to Arlong, Nami calls him just a fool who fell for her trickery. As for Arlong himself, I really enjoyed how they set him up as a villain here. I'll have to give you some minor The Walking Dead comic book spoilers, so if you're worried about those, skip to this time on the screen. Alright, so in the comic books, there's this character named Negan, who in a way does the same exact thing that Arlong does. He essentially forces other people to pay him for protection. That protection, of course, is as much from the zombies as it is from Negan himself and his group. I've always enjoyed these sorts of characters. They are obviously villains, right? But it is also in their best interest to not hurt the people under them, because that would in turn harm them. So with these sort of antagonists, you rarely see them just try to fight you right away, which of course results in a far more interesting story as many questions arise over how powerful they really are. In the Walking Dead example, this plays out to the fullest, as all the communities under Negan join forces and fight back, proving that Negan's control wasn't actually fully there. It was merely an illusion constructed to keep everyone in a constant state of fear. We'll get to this a little later, but this is of course exactly what Arlong does as well. Though unlike the previously mentioned Negan, Arlong also has a few more questionable beliefs, with him describing the fishman species as clearly superior, and that alone means that humans should be under them. And this was yet another example of me getting something in One Piece that I certainly did not expect. If you recall, in the first video I talked about how I was surprised about the commentary on gender discrimination. Well, yeah, I didn't really expect a racist villain either. And this of course is played up to the fullest, as when speaking to Zoro, he insults him in nearly every single way possible, saying that his brain is too small to comprehend what he's saying, that he's weaker, and so on. All of this is to say is that I already wanted to see Arlong go down, but the worst was still of course yet to come. Returning to what I mentioned about Nami, after calling Zoro a fool, she reveals that she is indeed a part of Arlong's crew, and shows Zoro her tattoo. Alright, time for us to go on another tangent. When talking about One Piece and anime in general, you have to remember that the story is largely built with the Japanese culture in mind, just like Western shows have their own specific characteristics. In turn, Nami's tattoo is actually far more important than you may realize, as tattoos in Japanese culture have a far different meaning than that of in the Western world, as they are largely associated with the Yakuza, or in other words, crime syndicates. It is such a taboo in fact that many onsens in Japan do not allow people with tattoos to enter, although this has somewhat changed in recent years, especially with the wider adoption of Western culture. But again, in the context of where the show takes place, it is a far more meaningful symbol than just a simple tattoo. And keep this in mind for later, as this will apply for Nojiko as well. Returning to the events at hand, with Zoro still being badly hurt from his fight against Hawkeyes, seeing Nami hit him over and over again convinced me that she had really been playing them all along. Though then of course, she does save him after throwing him into the water, and just like that, I was once again unsure what exactly was going on here. Was this all a play for Arlong? Zoro was mostly fine after all, or is she really on Arlong's side, but just couldn't kill Zoro? Needless to say, I was absolutely puzzled. We then meet Genzo, and his interaction with Arlong once again shows us what type of antagonist Arlong is. Instead of sending a few of his henchmen to take care of the problem, he arrives himself along with his entire crew. It's clearly overkill, but it's once again the image he's trying to build. He alone is in control here, and he even says that the humans should be honored to pay tribute to the creation of the Arlong Empire. His goals are completely unambiguous. He wishes to take over the whole of East Blue, which would of course mean that everyone is essentially a slave of his, paying tribute simply to survive. After this outing, Arlong and Nami return to Arlong Park, where Usopp has been taken prisoner. And oh boy was I conflicted here. As Usopp tries to pull a sneak attack, Nami is the one to react and immediately strike back. Without knowing what's to come, I was unsure whether she did that to protect him, because the others would obviously be a lot more harsh. Or was she really just taking care of a problem? Especially with her inner dialogue saying that everything was so close to working out. Obviously there's some sort of scheme here, yet I still couldn't piece it together. But then, Nami stabs Usopp. And yeah, in case you're wondering, this absolutely tricked me. Nami then restates that she is just doing business. All of this is simply to buy the village and there is no friendship here. To which Arlong responds that there is nothing worse than breaking a promise concerning money. And now we'll have to go on yet another tangent, as I've found that these sorts of villains do actually have these specific rules that they will not cross, even if everything else they do is already pretty messed up. Using the previously mentioned Negan example again, he would treat you absolutely fairly as long as you paid the tribute. In that sense, he was an honorable character, as he did hold up his end of the bargain. So I kind of took it as Arlong also fitting into that stereotype, where he may indeed hold true to this agreement. After Luffy and Sanji reach the island, they learn that Nami has apparently killed Usopp, to which Luffy responds that there is no way she could have done that. And again, I couldn't tell if this was denial or was Luffy really right about her. And just as this is going on, Nami herself shows up, and we get this conversation between her and Luffy, where she asks what they are doing here, to which Luffy responds, "Isn't it obvious? We came to get you." And keep this specific interaction in mind for later. Thankfully though, soon after we find out that Usopp is still indeed alive, and that Nami just tricked everyone, including me. We then cut to Nami and Nojiko sitting at a table, with Nojiko asking who the people that have come to get her really are, and that Nami had actually been happy while traveling with them. And yeah, I already knew what this would mean. I was absolutely about to have my feelings blasted. And so, we drift into a flashback. And yeah, these two episodes were exactly like the Zoro and Sanji flashbacks. Perfectly designed to get you attached to these characters and then rip the rug from under you. We meet Bellamere, who took it upon herself to look after Nami and Nojiko from a very young age, all the while dealing with money troubles as is. This is of course where the tangerine growing comes from. She would even lie about being on a diet to hide the fact that they are just very poor. And let's be real, How can you not feel bad for them and immediately root for Bellemere here? Especially with Nami often bursting out, as kids often do, and saying that she's not even her real mother and so on. Just thinking about that from Bellemere's point of view already tore me apart. Imagine giving up everything to just look after these two kids and hearing something like that. It's obvious that she did not fully mean it, but outbursts do often hint at true hidden thoughts a person may have. But then of course, Arlong shows up and everything changes. And this is where I wanted to bring up what I mentioned before. He does not attack anyone just yet. Instead, he gets his payment through intimidation. What's more is that he makes them pay just enough to make sure that they are still capable of paying again. Because if he didn't, an uprising against him would of course be far more likely, as there would be no other option at that point. And then comes the blasting. We cut to Bellemere, who is joyfully cooking for her family, and even saying that she knows she'll regret it, but that they should splurge a little. Before we get to the sadness, I did really enjoy Bellemere knocking Arlong on his ass. Seeing his smug face with his whole superior species talk knocked down by a badass mom just felt right. Though that feeling would not last, as he quickly retaliates. Though again, it is worth mentioning that despite having a gun shoved in his face moments earlier, Arlong does not kill her right away, because once again, to him, people are a resource. After naming the price, however, there is no way for her to pay. Nami and Nojiko then run to Bellemere, and the blasting began. They cry out as Bellemere, fully understanding what's about to happen, calmly says that she simply wishes she could have provided for them better and been a better mother. And yeah, my jaw had dropped and I was staring at the screen in disbelief. I really could not believe that Arlong would destroy this family right here, right now. But then again, if he didn't, the illusion he had built would be over. And just like that, Bellemere is shot. A mere token of force and fear in Arlong's scheme. And right after that, there's this brutal scene of the girls crying out, "Please, no more dying." Yeah, this episode was absolutely brutal. I know I've been saying that a bunch already, but I honestly did not expect these sorts of stories to come out of One Piece. The many trials and tribulations of a poor household, living under a dictator like Force, and so on. After seeing the backstory of the village, we can finally piece together the reason behind Nami's plan. She took it upon herself to travel across the world, make money any way she can, and buy her village back from Arlong. For Nami at least, this may be somewhat a childish ambition, but when I think about it in a real-life setting, I think it becomes far more relatable. Personally, whenever I am working in any sort of group setting and things are not going as planned, I will always think whether it was because I did not do well enough, and how I alone can fix it. I talked about this a little more in my Steins Gate video as well, but these sorts of thoughts always plague my mind. And in most situations, I do in fact pull a Nami and put all of the responsibility on my own shoulders. And just like we saw with Nami, this is most certainly not the best course of action, as no one person, let alone a kid, should take that sort of responsibility. What's worse is that my initial assumption of Arlong at least holding up his end of the bargain turned out to be wrong, as he makes a deal with the Marines to take Nami's treasure. This way, of course, he does not directly do it himself, but the net effect is still the same. Nami heads to Arlong to confront him, to which he responds by saying that if Nami bails on their agreement, he will just kill everyone in the village. And once again, Nami is left with all of that responsibility on her shoulders, as she fakes being just fine and tells everyone in the village that she is perfectly okay. Gen can obviously tell that she is lying, and hugs her, saying that it's enough, and that they'll fight Arlong. And then there is this fantastic scene of Arlong's laughter being spliced in with Nami finally breaking down, just to show you that looming threats of Arlong's crew. What follows is perhaps the best scene in the series so far, as Nami grips her tattooed shoulder, trying to rip the very flesh out of her arm, and then proceeds to cry out while repeatedly stabbing it. She's interrupted by Luffy, who simply says that yeah, he knows that she told him to leave. Nami continues to cry out in both anger and pure desperation, just screaming for Luffy to get out of here. Then, there's a moment of complete silence, with the only noise being Nami sobbing and the wind blowing in as Nami turns and mutters the words, "Luffy, help me." That silence continues as Luffy takes off his straw hat, puts it on Nami's head, turns around, and screams that of course he will. Yeah, this scene really pulled at my heartstrings big time. But there's even more to this. Aside from the fantastic voice acting and perfectly written moments of pure grief, this is also a major moment for Luffy's character. If you recall, Luffy immediately made it clear that he does not think Nami killed Usopp. His level of trust in his companions is already very high, and he's willing to do almost anything to help them. But this right here is exactly how Shanks acted. Just like him, Luffy calmly responds that he knows she sent him away, but it's clear to him that she needed help, so he didn't listen, and now he's here for her. That usual silly Luffy is gone, and that cold, serious captain is here. One whose crew is his #1 priority. After that, we get this awesome scene of Johnny and Yosuke telling the village to wait until the real heroes show up. Those of course being the Straw Hats. And oh boy, this roller coaster of emotions just kept going as we see the squad all together, calmly pacing their way toward Arlong Park. Man, this shot was just fantastic and carries that one for all and all for one vibe perfectly. Luffy knocks a huge hole in the wall, and just like that, the final battle for Kokoyashi Village begins. Alright, there are so many details of this fight I want to talk about that I don't really know even how to structure this part, so I'll try to give you a little bit of extra context as to what I am talking about. The fight starts with all the characters pretty much getting their own adversary. Usopp is chased away by Chu, Luffy fighting Hachan, and Sanji fighting Kurobi. But the important thing here is that Luffy is taken out of the fight almost right away, as he is thrown into the water by the battlefield. And here, I just want to mention once again how much I enjoy this aspect of the Devil Fruit. All it takes for Luffy to be defeated, or at least incapacitated for a while, is for him to be thrown into some water. But in this case, the antagonists excel in water combats, making it even more of a difficult situation. So with Luffy out of the picture, Zoro now takes on Hachan, who takes advantage of his octopus abilities and uses 6 swords. And just to keep it simple, we'll go through the entire Zoro fight and then move on to the other characters. The thing with Zoro is that he is still very much hurting from the duel with Hawkeyes, and he's only got 1 sword right now. So his special 3-sword technique is also out of the picture. And during this fight, I really enjoyed how we got the constant inner turmoil and struggle of Zoro, who's trying to re-establish his goal of becoming the best swordsman, all the while fighting through unimaginable pain. And just like when he was a kid, he gets back up, stating that he still has one man he needs to face, and that there is no way he'll lose to Hachan. After Johnny and Yosuke lend him their swords, Zoro is back in the game, and the 3-sword style is back. The imagery here is just brilliant, with Zoro fighting more than just the battle against Hachan, as Hawkeyes stares over him. I feel like this was an extremely important fight for Zoro, as after his defeat at Baratie, he now had to re-establish himself as the master swordsman that he is, and he couldn't let both Luffy and Kuina down, as he promised to never lose again. Overall, I feel like what Zoro says himself perfectly encapsulates the fight. His sword simply carries more weight, so it does not matter whether he's fighting someone with twice as many. And I'm really glad that the enemy he went up against was indeed a swordsman, so that we could get this introspective look into Zoro's thought process. Meanwhile, Sanji takes on Kurobi, who's also a martial artist. Again, I really love the mirrored antagonist here. Though unlike Zoro, who just had a straight up duel, Sanji is also trying to get to Luffy, who's still in the water. While I think this battle wasn't as important for Sanji's development as Zoro's was, it still showed us that he is very much a skilled fighter as well. And that's what I think makes this arc excel in many ways. Each and every character has a clear purpose in his fight against Arlong. It's kind of like those classic RPGs where you would delegate fighters who could counter the opponent's abilities, rather than simply sending in your strongest character, that of course being Luffy in this case. Usopp, on the other hand, has quite a bit of character growth here, just like Zoro. It's no secret that in terms of fighting prowess, he doesn't even stand close to Zoro and Sanji, but he makes up for that with his creative approach and trickery to battle. After he takes the initial hit from Cho, he debates just giving up. But then, he remembers the stories that he told to Kaya, and that is enough to get him back in the fight. Yeah, his methods are quite bizarre, but the result is there. And despite being scared out of his mind for half the fight, he can still think on his feet incredibly well, adapting to the battle in a near instant. And for me, this really lifted Usopp as a character, as so far, I kind of thought of him as the least specialized member of the crew. What I mean by that is that Luffy is of course the captain, Zoro is just an expert fighter, Sanji is a cook, Nami is a navigator, but who is Usopp? He's sort of a tactician, but is he really? Well, for me at least, this fight more than showed that he is capable of fending for himself. You can of course argue that if the fishman wouldn't have simply walked away, he would have been toast, but I don't really think that's a fair argument in this case, as it can be applied to pretty much any scenario. All in all, I do think this was a great character developing fight. And just before Luffy himself gets back into the battle, we had this brilliant scene of Nami heading to Arlong Park. While Arlong is talking to the villagers and Nami, his speech is spliced with images of a butterfly almost getting caught in a spider web. The butterfly, of course, being Nami, and the spider web being Arlong's crew. And for a brief moment, we see that she is seriously thinking about how she could once again save the entire village, as the image of the spider appears once again. And just as the butterfly is almost caught in the web, she breaks free, and the fight is back on. Was this something super in-depth and complex? No, not really. But was it a cool addition to symbolize Nami's inner struggle just like we saw with Zoro and Hawkeye's looming over him? Absolutely. With Luffy still being freed, Zoro then engages Arlong himself, but with his current wounds, his fighting is already over. And for a moment, Arlong hesitates, asking himself whether he's already fighting a dead man. And this is what I mentioned before, with some of these villains having their own unwritten rules that they will not break. So for a moment, I did think that Arlong's pride is getting in his way, and so he wouldn't harm Zoro. Zoro breaks the silence, however, telling him that if you remain still, wounds won't open up, as we cut to Hachan dying in the waters below. And so Luffy is freed and the final fight begins. And what I really loved here was just how the rest of the characters just sit back and finally get a breather, with Zoro being washed up on some stairs, and Sanji simply sitting down and saying that if Luffy loses, they'll all die anyway. During the fight, we also get a look at where Nami drew up those maps, which Luffy aims to destroy, to finally rid her of any association with Arlong's crew. And again, I love the Shanks-like moment where Luffy is 100% serious, and honestly, a tad spooky in just how dedicated he is. Between the both of them, they rip the entire building apart, and after the fight is done, Luffy just calls out to Nami, and just calls her his friend. And I absolutely loved this brief moment of quiet, where we can just let go of that held breath, because the fight is done. These sorts of moments, when done right, are incredibly impactful, and I feel like this one was done very well, especially with just how much Arlong was built up as this looming force. Not only that, but Zoro was also dealing with his own battle against himself. In short, this fight was just fantastic. What I also loved was that, similar to Baratier, we got an episode where the characters could just chill out for a bit and all the storylines got wrapped up. And I suppose I can do the same. Regarding Nojiko, Nami's sister, if you recall what I said about tattoos in Japanese culture being quite taboo, Nojiko got hers only to make Nami feel better about getting hers. She intentionally chose to damage her image to the rest of society in order to support her sister, who had been forced to get the tattoo. And again, I feel like this is just another very nice small detail to further show us just how tight-knit this family had become through their tragic childhood and then later being raised by Bellemere. As for Nami finally deciding to leave the village and join back up with Luffy, there's another really touching scene of her standing in their childhood home as Bellemere sits at the table. She doesn't say anything, she just smiles and listens as Nami says that she is finally free. Personally, I feel like Bellemere just listening was a far more impactful scene than if she were to respond in a dreamlike scene, as this showed us Nami finding closure, especially when she disappears and then pushes Nami out of the door. And finally, we also find out why Genzo had that pinwheel on his hat, which Luffy constantly asked about. It was all just to make baby Nami smile. If you don't think that is just pure wholesome goodness, then you do not have a heart. And if your feels hadn't quite been blasted enough already, we then find out that Nami got a new tattoo of a tangerine and the pinwheel. Nojiko asks Genzo where his pinwheel was now, to which he responds by laughing as we cut to Bellemere's grave and the pinwheel spinning in the ground. After all these years, Genzo finally moved on from the assumption that Nami is still a kid and needs protecting. And on that super wholesome note, that was Arlong Park. I'll be frank, after Baratier, this one had a lot to live up to, as I genuinely found every moment of it nearly flawless. But oh boy, I think by this point you already know what I'm going to rank this one. I mean, this arc was the biggest roller coaster of emotions imaginable, once again getting you incredibly attached to this very caring and just overall pure character, and then smacking you in the face 3 times harder than any of the previous times by killing them off. And I think that's what stung here the most. Bellemere genuinely gave up everything for her 2 daughters, and even her final words were just that she wished she could have been a better mother. This is exactly the reason why I feel like Nami's actions were actually more than justified, as she had to deal with forgiving herself about what she said to Bellemere, and how she wasn't their real mother, as well as taking on the responsibility of buying the village from Arlong. And again, that scene of Nami just breaking down and asking for help, oh my feels why, followed by Luffy almost echoing Shanks and then the inner turmoil of Zoro. Come on, this is hands down an S tier arc. Yep, I enjoyed this one even more than Baratier, primarily because of Arlong, who is a far better villain in my opinion. What's more is that these arcs are written perfectly back to back, with much of Zoro's story dealing with the events of Baratier. There's really not too much else to say. This was really, in my view, a perfect arc. As usual, we'll see how these rankings shift around later, but with how well these two work together, I don't see them being knocked down from S tier anytime soon. And that brings us to the end of yet another very long video. Initially, I was going to cover Logtown in this one as well, but seeing how the script went, I decided that it would be better leaving that one as is. Speaking of which, I wanted to address some feedback I got on the first episode in this series. A few of you mentioned that you want to hear more of my own takes rather than how I only drop minor bits between events. And I totally hear ya. I fear that this video might have gone a tad too far in the opposite direction, But again, do let me know what you thought. Finding that balance between giving context for people who either need a refresher or maybe have not watched the series at all, and my own thoughts is fairly difficult. Anyway, if you want to hear what I'm up to, all the social media links are below. And other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.